African heads of state and government urged richer countries on the planet to make the necessary contributions to hit an ambitious $120 billion replenishment target for one of the World Bank's main funds, the IDA. Now, the International Development Association lends to low-income economies, often at concessional rates. Sometimes it might even give grants. Of the 75 countries that have borrowed from it, 39 are right here in Africa, and they're all dealing with multiple challenges, from extreme droughts and floods all the way to debt crises on the other end of the scale. At that event, the World Bank's head, AJ Banga, said that the institution would reform the IDA by cutting burdensome rules and requirements. Now, some hours ago, I spoke to Dr. Daouda Sembene. He's an economist and the founder of the advisory firm AfriCatalyst. Prior to that, he was an executive director at the IMF. And I started our conversation by exploring how policymakers in the West, who are distracted by multiple elections and conflicts worldwide, may not necessarily meet that very ambitious capital-raising target.
Well, it's true that there are a lot of emergencies actually, and crises going on around the world that could sort of capture part of the resources, the meager resources that are available, and that could also divert the resources from IDA. But I think one thing that has to be clear is, I think by contributing to IDA, there is a lot of things that donor countries would be allowing to happen. First of all, of course, they would be supporting those countries that are recipients of IDA, whether it's from Africa. In Africa, there are 39 of them out of the 75 countries around the world that are eligible to receive IDA resources. So they would help those countries address those debt challenges that you talked about. In Africa, for instance, 21 countries are already in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress, which is a lot when you compare to the continent and the other region around the world. They would also help countries address fragilities. Fragility is an issue that has a lot of implication, not just in the countries that are affected by fragility, but around the world. So this is an issue that certainly would require the global north to also pay attention.
Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that that $120 billion target for replenishment is not met, and we have to work with a smaller pool of resources, especially across the 39 or so countries that essentially do borrow money from IDA. How do we make every cent count? How do we make IDA funding as efficient as possible? Because I know in some cases, when it comes to dealing with the World Bank, some of the concerns that have emerged is, you look at project disbursement rates, and the project absorption rates are relatively low. It can be something in the order of 38%, 40%, so far less than it really should be. How do we make this more efficient?
Well, I think to me that that's already embedded in the IDA policy framework. As you know, for a country to be allocated IDA resources, first of all, it has to show that it has been performing well in terms of its policies, in terms of its managing its economies, but also in terms of managing the IDA project that it previously sort of benefited from. So this is something that really makes sure that help make sure that the IDA resources are allocated to the right countries that really deserve it. So I think that's something that is already being handled by the World Bank in collaboration with the IDA recipient. I think the question should be not to really do our best not to achieve that target, but how best we can do to achieve that target. I think that's the most critical issue, and there is no reason why that target shouldn't be sort of achieved if there is enough political commitment.
Let me just wrap up with a counter argument to that. We've seen these very same countries that have been adversely affected by the ravages of climate change. We've had an unseasonably warm and seasonably early harmattan, for example, in West Africa, which has in part affected the cocoa harvest in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. Right now, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, well, not Uganda, but Kenya, Tanzania, and parts of Rwanda, they're being hit by an unseasonably heavy amount of rainfall around El Nino. And yet all of these countries have struggled to get access to climate finance because the countries that do have the capital have simply not provided the capital that's required. So given what's happened in the past on the climate space, and yes, we acknowledge on both sides, on the donor side, on the recipient side, we all acknowledge that climate change is a problem. Climate finance has to be provided to deal with that problem. And yet that's not happened. So given that sort of background, why should we be optimistic about IDA replenishment being successful this year?
Yeah, and this is exactly why actually we are calling for a historic replenishment of AIDA this year. Why? Because as you indicated, many countries in Africa are facing a lot of challenges accessing those climate finance that we are talking about. I think Africa is known to receive less than 5% of climate finance, which is very low. And when you know that AIDA is one of the largest sources of climate finance around the world, there is certainly a case to be made here that it needs to be replenished as to make sure that it continue to provide this low cost funding that it can provide to these countries so that they can be able to implement their policies in terms of adaptation and mitigation, and also making sure that they build resilience to climate shocks. And as you indicated, I think what we are seeing right now in the horns of Africa or in Southern Africa in terms of natural disasters and flooding and drought is also another sort of testimony that we need to do more in making sure that these countries are able to access enough resources to fund their adaptation policies.